Churchill comes in, and suddenly there's an atmosphere of almost optimism. I mean, he's a great speaker, as we know. His broadcasts are inspiring. He's using the threat of invasion to very great effect. The Battle of Britain goes very well eventually. So, against a backdrop of what could have been quite a lot of fear of an invasion.
Hello. In the summer of 1940, Britain was on its knees. The British Expeditionary Force had fled from mainland Europe in humiliation, and Nazi Germany eyed the southeast of England greedily. All that stood between Hitler and his SS marching up the Mall was a thin strip of English Channel. My guest today is Alex Gerlis, who has written The Second Traitor, a novel set in those dark days of the first year of the Second World War. We talk about Operation Sea Lion, its likelihood, and Nazi sympathisers in both Britain and Ireland. Plenty more great history on the way with best-selling authors, so please do share with friends and family. But in the meantime, it's me talking with Alex Gerlis on Operation Sea Lion. Alex, welcome back to the podcast. Great pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much, Ollie. Good to be back.
And we are talking about this sequel to the last time you were on, when you were talking about Every Spy a Traitor, the first of your new series. This is number 2. This is The Second Traitor, the introduction of a second traitor. For the benefit of listeners, and I've put a link in for the first conversation that we had, just in case someone wants to go back and have a listen to that. But we were very much in the build-up to the Second World War for the Every Spy a Traitor, and so this was, in the environment of the 1930s and the rise of well-educated Englishmen betraying their country. So for number 2, though, actually the war has broken out, and it's an interesting time that you've started the book, actually, and it's sort of we're a year into the war and things aren't looking great for Britain at all. So, I mean, that's kind of perfect groundwork for a traitorous bunch to be working in, because things aren't looking good for Britain.
No, I mean the first book, Every Spy a Traitor, finished pretty much on the day that war was announced, and the idea was to. I talked about it a bit with my editors, and they thought, no, finish at that point so that there's kind of a clean break, and I think that was the right call. So this one is starting a few months into the war. So Cooper, who kind of has to flee London on the day that war is announced, and kind of heads off to King's Cross. This is now, he's back in circulation, so to speak, and they're picking up what's going on. And what I was trying to get into, and I always look for, as you know, a real historical event or sequence of events to build the book around. And the Operation Sea Lion, the planned Nazi invasion of this country in 1940, seemed to be perfect for me. And I didn't know as much about it as I thought I should do, because I think what people, know about Sea Lion is, well, it didn't happen. So would you need to know an awful lot about an operation that didn't happen? And I think that it's underexplored in some ways. I think the connection between Sea Lion and the Battle of Britain is enormously significant, because the Battle of Britain is not a discrete event on its own, but effectively, the more I read around it and looked into it, the most of the senior Germans in the Navy and the Air Force, and certainly the military, were never very keen on the idea of invading Britain. Yeah, not because they didn't think they didn't think morally it was the right thing to do. They would have been perfectly happy with it, but it was just such an enormous undertaking. So if you think about D-Day, 4 years later, and over and that was over a shorter distance across the Channel, when the Allies were in much more control of events. They pretty much had aerial dominance in June 1944 in northern France. So there was a lot more capability in June 1944, and even then it was a massive and precarious undertaking. But the actual planning for Sea Line envisaged towing hundreds, if not thousands, of barges from various ports around the northern France and the Netherlands and a few in Germany. Rotterdam, which I went to visit as part of the research, was the main port. So what they were doing was gathering barges from around Europe, the bigger barges, the sea-going barges, the river barges, and I go into some detail in the book about what their capability was in terms of carrying tanks. I mean, even a fairly good river barge could probably take 2 or 3 tanks over, but there was quite a lot of conversion. So in Rotterdam in particular, they took the barges into one dock where they converted them and then took them into other docks where they stored them. And the idea was that at one stage they were going to tow across the Channel and the North Sea hundreds, if not thousands, of these barges, loaded with up to 100,000 men, hundreds, if not thousands, of tanks and other armour. And then there was some discussion about where they would land. Should they land across a longer strip of the southeast or a fairly narrow part? And they could never completely decide. And the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was absolutely certain that they would not contemplate going across unless they knew they had air superiority. The last thing that they wanted as they're towing these barges, sitting ducks, if you like, was to have the RAF attacking them all the time. So that was the real reason for the Battle of Britain, was to try and negate the effectiveness of the RAF, and they thankfully failed in that respect. And one of the consequences of the Allied victory in the Battle of Britain was it helped to knock Operation Sea Lion on the head. And Hitler knew that. I mean, he never actually formally said, right, it's over, we're not going to invade Britain, but he kind of let it go. And the key point from then on was he could then turn his attention to the east, to Russia, and kind of Operation Barbarossa stems from the abandonment, if you like, of Operation Sea Lion.
And so I mean, perhaps we can indulge in a little bit of what if.
Yeah.
But if we could say that the Battle of Britain had not gone as it did, and so the Battle of Britain had been lost, what do you think because the Kriegsmarine would still have to deal with the Royal Navy, but obviously the Royal Navy are now having to deal with the Luftwaffe as well.
Yeah.
Would
I mean, the Royal Navy was very, very strong. It completely outnumbered the Kriegsmarine, remember? But yeah, you're right. Carry on.
And yeah, but they wouldn't have had much air power though. So how do you think? I mean, if the Royal Air Force have been knocked out, does that therefore make Operation Sea Lion a lot more realistic?
Well, I think if it's not completely indulging in fantasy to say what would have happened if the Luftwaffe won the Battle of Britain. And I think in those circumstances, it would have been hard for the Kriegsmarine, whose heart still wasn't in it. They still had a lot of doubts about it, because if you think about, look at the map from Rotterdam and some of the other ports around there, but look at Rotterdam in particular, which is an enormous port. It's like a seaport. You go from Rotterdam to the southeast coast of England. It's a long journey across kind of quite dangerous waters. And one of the problems, of course, on D-Day was that the natural elements, that there was the end of a storm and some of the boats didn't quite make it when they launched off. So it was a massive undertaking, but it would have been more feasible. Quite what the Allied defences were like, is a little bit open to question. I mean, they did have defences around. What's interesting too is that I was going to say Shakespeare. I've got no idea why I was going to say Shakespeare. Churchill was slightly using the threat of a German invasion to whip everyone into action to kind of shake the country out of any complacency. And by saying that there was likely to be, or there was a good chance of a German invasion, that probably contributed to a kind of certain alertness in the population. So they were thinking about it. There were kind of a few divisions around there in the south. So if they'd landed in enough numbers to be able to move inland, which was quite a big if, that would have been quite interesting to see how far they could have gone. It's very hard to say. And one of the things that I came across early on in researching this book is I found an organisation existed, which had it not existed, I would have had to invent. So in the previous book, I invented a fictional British intelligence agency called the Annex, which was fine, but it didn't exist. In this case, I would have probably had to come up with a similar organisation in which to funnel some of the people like Cooper, who previously worked for the Annex, who'd be involved in an intelligence operation that wasn't quite part of MI5 or MI6. And I discovered that there was something called the Invasion Warning Subcommittee, which very, very few people have heard of. But the Invasion Warning Subcommittee operated out of the old War Office, which it was then called the Old War Office. And it's that magnificent building on Whitehall opposite Horse Guards that's now a Raffles Hotel. And I went to have a look round it. They let me look and go into the basement where it was where it was based. And it was a short-lived intelligence organisation whose job was to warn, if you like, to anticipate the invasion. But the invasion was as much, and this is what I get into in the book. It was as much about intelligence as it was about an actual military operation. So they didn't know, the Germans, quite what the state of Allied defences were like. They didn't know if you went down to the places in the south where they might land, the beach they might land, that how easy it would be to get from the beach to the roads, what the roads were like, what the size were, if there was a bridge, would it be strong enough to take tanks, all that kind of thing. So the Abwehr, German intelligence, from their base in Hamburg, which is this magnificent building, kind of a 1930s utilitarian style, if you like, more Art Nouveau than anything else. An extraordinary building where they also had a number of German military divisions had their headquarters. And the building still exists. It was never bombed. It's kind of north of the centre. So it still exists. And I went to visit it when I was on a research trip in Hamburg, and I had a guide with me, and we kind of went in. I just said to him, well, let's go in. And it's now been converted into luxury apartments. And, he explained to the concierge, why I was interested. And we were basically asked to leave, which didn't stop me kind of when I was writing a piece about it in the Express, saying I was thrown out of the intelligence headquarters kind of thing, which was true in a way. But from there, they were sending over spies. So, the kind of flurry of spies that came over in 39 and 40, that was all linked to Sea Line. And they were sending over really second and third rate agents. They were recruiting quite a lot of phlegm, so Belgian and Dutch, obviously. People that spoke some English, in some cases quite good English, but they were sending them over. Their background was either that they'd been bribed or blackmailed, or that they were Nazis, and they had some ability in English. So they thought, all right, we'll have you. They send them off to Hamburg, train them for a bit, and then send them over, usually coming off a U-boat into a dinghy and coming ashore. And so many of them were caught. I mean, what we don't know, of course, is we don't know what we don't know. It's pretty certain that all of them were captured, but it's not impossible that some of them came ashore and maybe just disappeared. Unlikely, but and I did have in one of my first books, I did have a character who was a German agent who did disappear and was never caught. So it's not impossible that there were one or two that were never caught, but by and large, they were all captured and either turned into double agents, so the double cross system, and used to feed disinformation back to the Germans, or put on trial and executed. There's a famous story of one guy in Lydd who, when he came ashore, knocked on the door of the local pub at about 9 in the morning and asked for a pint of cider. And the landlady kind of looks down at this man with a foreign accent and a handful of coins and wet trousers and dirty shoes covered in sand. And she was smart enough to say, well, could he come back in half an hour when she was open? And she knew a couple of RAF guys were billeted in the house a couple of doors along. She woke them up, or got them up. They came there, so they were waiting when he came back half an hour later for his cider. And they took him to the local police station, and he was executed a few weeks later. So there were quite a lot. They were very, very poor, very second rate. And there's even a theory that the Abwehr. So you know a bit about the background of the Abwehr is that it was run by Admiral Canaris, who was never a Nazi. It was eventually executed for opposition to Hitler. And people have always wondered about whether Canaris always knew that the D-Day landings were going to be in Normandy as opposed to the Pas-de-Boulogne, but he probably allowed, or it's thought he may have allowed, Hitler to believe it was not going to be in Normandy. We don't know that, and nor do we know whether they were deliberately sending over second or third rate agents, because if they got such poor intelligence or non-intelligence back from the UK mainland about a possible invasion, that would help lead to its cancellation. We don't know for sure. If I was writing a non-fiction history of it, I'd obviously have to approach it very differently, but it's fine if you're writing fiction.
Yeah, certainly. But it's so tantalizing. So there could have been agents, one or two agents who escaped the net and decided to just keep a low profile and live here happily ever after.
Yeah, I think it may well have come out after the war. It could have come out after the war. Someone might have asked about it, but I don't think it's impossible. I mean, I have written about a couple of people, in other books where they have done that, and we don't know for sure. But if you've say blackmailed someone and send them over, and they land here, and so they come on shore. I don't know, say in Norfolk, and after a precarious 24 hours you've landed, you've managed to change out of the kind of clothes you've landed in, you've got a civilian suit on, reasonable paperwork, and it gets you to London or to Manchester, wherever. What are you going to do? Do you think, well, do I want to carry on working for the Germans and be caught by the British and executed as a spy or whatever? Or do I just go along with this and maybe volunteer for farm work? And then over a period of a couple of years, you can change your identity or get proper paperwork. I don't know, but it's certainly feasible to think that it could have happened.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show.
Well, the other element to your book that I was interested in was this this kind of I think you've called them the group.
Yeah.
Which is this kind of network of traitors, effectively. They are Nazi collaborators. And what did that come? Where did you get the idea for that? And is there any kind of grounding in? I mean, I guess the most obvious thing is Oswald Mosley's black shirts, but
yeah, they were a bit more than that actually. I just so this book is by a guy called Neil Storey, and I appeared at the Lincoln Book Festival with him a couple of years ago, and so I read the book beforehand, and the director of the Lincoln Book Festival had wondered about putting fiction and non-fiction writers together, but it worked very well because he worked in this kind of conspiracy area. But he did a lot of research at Kew, and there's lists and lists here of people who were Many of them, their background was in the black shirts, but not all of them. Quite a lot of them were people who had strong familial or personal links with Germany. And they were people who, to one extent or another, were sympathisers of Nazi Germany and were, if you like, a fifth column or a potential fifth column in this country. So in Neil's book, which is well worth looking at, there are lists and lists of people at the back with all their names. So just completely randomly. There's one here, I'm being completely random, but Charles Cuthbert Smith, and it's got his address in Southampton, governor of a young offenders prison, dismissed for British Union of Fascist membership. And it's full of people like that who were known for being fascists. And so the group is a fictionalized form of these people being slightly more organized. And the purpose of the group is to have a link, if you like, for these spies coming over so they could link in with them. And the other dimension of the group, which I don't know if you're going to touch on to, is the Irish connection.
Yes. What inspired that? Because during the Second World War, there was a border campaign going on in Northern Ireland by the IRA.
Yeah.
Is there any element of the IRA with this?
There is quite a strong element to the IRA because the IRA's basic view is my enemy's enemy is my friend. So they were only a few years out of an art. Well, they still consider themselves in armed struggle against the British occupiers, if you like, and they were still fighting for United Ireland. So suddenly they've got for them, kind of unexpected and tantalising prospect of, in 1940, of the British mainland being conquered and taken over by the Nazis, and that was a little bit too much for them to resist. So there were links established between the IRA and the Germans. There's no doubt about that. So much so that in 1940, the two people turned up in Hamburg. One was Sean Riley, who was the IRA chief of staff, and he was sent over to be trained by the Germans as an agent, to be sent back to Ireland and then come over to the mainland, because there was still quite a lot of movement between, you could still move between the UK mainland and between Ireland and the UK mainland with the right paperwork and everything. And then the other one was a IRA member who'd been captured in Spain and I think ended up in Germany, and he volunteered. So the two of them were trained by the Abwehr in Hamburg, put on a U-boat in Wilhelmshaven, and the idea was that they'd then be brought back to Ireland. The only thing was that Riley had a history of stomach disorder, and he died on the ship on the U-boat. It's thought probably of a burst ulcer or something, and he's now quite disgracefully commemorated. He's got his statue in a park in Dublin. So it's some kind of perverse thinking that a man who died as a Nazi collaborator on a Nazi mission, that is deemed fit that he can have a statue in a park in Dublin. But there we are. So there were links, unquestionably there were links between the IRA and the prospect of this country being invaded and conquered by the Nazis, but nothing much ever really happened. But the whole subject of kind of Ireland in the Second World War and to what extent they were neutral. I mean, there was certainly one or two German spies who had landed in Northern Ireland, crossed into the Republic, and may or may not have come over. And De Valera was very, whose side was he on? I mean, when Hitler died, at the end of April 1945, when it was pretty obvious which way the war was going or had gone, he went to sign a book of condolence at the German embassy. And I ended up having quite a bit of row with, on Twitter about this. And some people, said they were Irish historians, tried to excuse it by saying, well, actually, De Valera was friendly with the German ambassador, who wasn't really a Nazi. and it was his way of kind of showing sympathy for him. But that's a rather bizarre way of kind of explaining away signing a book of condolence. And he was very dismissive de Valera of when the British troops liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. All the newsreels when this came out, he kind of dismissed it as British propaganda and said it probably hadn't happened. So I think there's probably little doubt that had the invasion taken place, it would have had support across the Irish Sea, but who knows?
Yes, it's a very interesting part of Irish history, the position during the Second World War.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, the whole question of neutral countries in the Second War is fascinating because you you just don't you can't really tell which way they were going. I mean, if you look at Portugal, Salazar was smarter than Franco. Anyways, I mean, Franco nailed his colours, early on to the German mask, quite clearly, and then changed tack probably just in time, kind of kept his neutrality. But Portugal was a bit more genuinely neutral. But it was difficult for these countries. Switzerland, Sweden were both neutral, but you would certainly say that for most of the war, they probably leaned slightly more towards Germany.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's a rather underexplored area actually. There's probably a book in all that,
I think
neutral.
there probably is actually, yeah. I mean, I've not come across one. I'd be surprised if there hadn't been one. But they were all very much tied into them. I mean, Sweden was very tied in because of for economic reasons with the Germans and everything. It was also kind of the way the land was connected. But yeah, definitely a subject for something.
Well, before we started recording, it was interesting. You were explaining. I mean, so just for the benefit of listeners here, this is the second in. I think it's going to be four.
It's four, yeah. So I'm just about. So Canello, my publisher, are now part of Penguin Random House, which is great in many ways. But you're plugged into a very, very precise and demanding schedule. So I have to deliver the next book, which is due to be published in August 26th. I've got to deliver it in October this year, so kind of fairly soon. So I'm at the moment on the penultimate chapter of the next book. So it's possible I'll have it finished even before the first one comes out, but that would just be the first draft. I mean, there'll be a lot of work goes on between the first draft or to get the second draft done. And then I usually go through it once more, and it's the third version that gets sent off to the publisher.
And so, and this is what I was interested when you were saying to me is that if you've got sort of fairly complicated plot lines involving traitors and spies, as yours does, it's trying to make sure that you don't give it away to the reader if you're in sort of, because obviously you want to reveal our traitor right at the end of book 4.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to accidentally do that in book 2. And this is quite a challenge, I suppose, for any author of espionage novels.
Yeah. I mean, even with I mean, it's hard enough doing it over 4 books, but even over 1 or 2 books, that you've got to do it you've got to write it in an intelligent way, so that you don't want you don't want to be such an unlikely figure, and the coincidence and the circumstances that lead to his or her unveiling are so convoluted that you don't want the reader to think, "Oh, come off it," that's just ridiculous. On the other hand, you want to leave some possible clues, but you don't want to give it away. And what you certainly don't want is someone to do a review on Amazon, because people can pretty much say what they want on Amazon reviews. And the last thing you want is someone on Amazon to say, "Oh, I know who it is, it's X," and that catches on or something like that.
Have you ever had that before?
No. I mean, I've had people that kind of go further in a review than you would like, saying, like this happens or that happens. But I'll be absolutely honest. I tend not to read the substance of Amazon reviews very much these days. But
I think that's sensible. Often you see the book arrived in packaging that had deteriorated, and you, as the
Yes.
author,
Or the other thing is, the most frustrating thing. I mean, someone told me the other day that they got a 1-star review from someone who then in the text said this was a fantastic book. I couldn't put it down, but a 1-star review kind of really brings down your ratings or something like that. Or I read 2 chapters and gave up, and you think, I just don't think that's fair. You can kind of. I just wouldn't review something I've just read 2 chapters. But yeah, that's the thing, is to try and keep it going. So in this book or in this series rather, there are 2 or 3 central characters who run throughout the series. A few more actually slightly less central. But the key question, which is established very early on, is that there is a well-educated, as you put it, British guy who gets into a senior position somewhere in the British intelligence foreign office community, who is a Russian spy, who's a traitor, and his code name is Archie. And the idea is that you do not find out who Archie is until the end of book 4. And I've got a good idea how I'm going to reveal who Archie is.
so you didn't. It's not like you've mapped it out before you even started writing book 1.
Well, I had to map out the series for the publishers, but the idea is that the book is going to fit. I wanted to have a bit of a scope of the 30s and 40s. So the book that I'm writing now, number 3, is set mainly in 44 and particularly 45. So it goes right through to VJ Day, and the very beginnings, in the kind of autumn of 1945, the very beginnings of the Cold War, and that's where it will finish. So book 4 will pick up in the Cold War, and then fast forward a bit to 1956 and Budapest. And I see Budapest as being kind of Hungary, as being key to the unveiling of Archie, the naming of Archie. And nothing that I've done in books 2 and 3 have kind of swayed me from that. It still works quite well.
Brilliant stuff. I'm interested, just going back to the second traitor, is this kind of atmosphere in your research. Did you find the sort of what the feeling was in the country at the time? Because obviously, this is post Dunkirk, post Battle of Britain, but we're still in the depths of basically Britain alone. How in your research, what did you find out about what the sort of underlying feeling in the country was?
I think there was a lot of uncertainty and nerves, but I think what's very important is that in the middle of it all, Churchill becomes Prime Minister. So that probably changes things. I know it's probably a bit trite to compare it to Football Manager, but you can imagine, really. I'm not sure quite how this metaphor is going to work. And my agent represents Churchill's estate as well, so I'm not sure what Gordon will think of this. But it's almost that Chamberlain was the manager of a team that's playing quite badly, and there's no spirit and no atmosphere in the ground. And then he's booted out, and they bring Churchill in, who a lot of people didn't really want. Remember, a lot of people wanted Halifax, who was an appeaser, but Churchill becomes. I think it was because the Labour Party was very anti the idea of Halifax, and they were quite keen on Churchill. So straight away there was this good relationship between Attlee and Churchill and everything. So Churchill comes in, and suddenly there's an atmosphere of almost optimism. I mean, he's a great speaker, as we know. His broadcasts are inspiring. He's using the threat of invasion to very great effect. The Battle of Britain goes very well eventually. So against a backdrop of what could have been quite a lot of fear of an invasion. I mean, people did think that there could be an invasion, and plans were being made for it. Remember, the road signs were removed. So there were virtually no road signs in this country. They were all removed at one point during 1940. So there was this very, very bad atmosphere. But so even before Sea Lion didn't happen, and there was kind of a cut-off point in September 1940, after which they couldn't have launched an invasion before because of the sea conditions until 1941. But even before then, I think there was a feeling of kind of being fairly positive, and they got through that. And then you get into 1941, and you've got Barbarossa, which changes everything enormously, doesn't it? Because first of all, it's not just us, but suddenly the Russians are the enemies of the Germans, and then by the end of the year, Barbarossa has gone quite badly wrong, and that's tracing it back really the beginning and the end for the Germans.
Well, I find that this period just really, because this is the lowest ebb. It's interesting that Churchill is such a, I guess, a booster for the country.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to know. When I say it's hard to know exactly why, I mean he was clearly a very charismatic figure, very confident, very effective, obviously good at making decisions. Much more so than Chamberlain was. So,
Yeah, yeah,
that was the key to it.
absolutely. Well, this story is number 2. We've got number 3 coming out next year then. And
So
then
number 3 is out in August 26, and then number 4 is penciled in for August 27.
fantastic stuff. Well, look, links are in the show notes for listeners. So this is the second traitor. This comes after every spy a traitor. And so, Alex, thanks so much for coming on. It's been great talking.
That's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.